Chris Bowen, welcome to ABC News 24.
Thanks, Lyndal.
Tony Abbott's receiving a briefing today from your officials. Presumably they're going to tell him the same things they've been telling you?
Well, we thought it was important that Tony Abbott have the expert advice that we receive. We thought, given the circumstances of this significant change in the law last week by the High Court, which means both the government and the opposition need to reflect, that it was the fair and reasonable thing to do to make that advice available to him. That advice is that we need a regional framework, that we need to provide a disincentive for people to come to Australia by boat, and that the sorts of arrangements we've put in place under the regional framework are the most effective. But it's appropriate that he get that advice directly from the experts.
Is he going to be told, or have you been told, as was in a leaked email from your Immigration Department Secretary to staff, that the part of the Pacific solution that worked was towing the boats back, or the threat to do that, and that is no longer an option because Indonesia won't cooperate?
Yes, certainly the advice to us is that the most effective deterrent is to return people to where they began the boat journey and tell them that they do not receive any preferential treatment in terms of resettlement in Australia, as opposed to Nauru, where people do end up in Australia if they're regarded as genuine refugees. The 95% of people who are regarded as genuine refugees ended up in Australia or New Zealand under the Howard government Pacific model. That's not a disincentive. But Malaysian arrangement, whereby we take more genuine refugees who've been processed, but people who come to Australia by boat were returned to Malaysia to be processed in line with everybody else awaiting resettlement under the UNHCR, is a more effective deterrent.
Do you have any options to return people to Indonesia? Because many boats leave from Indonesia, don't they?
Well, look, this is what the Howard government tried to do, as you referred to, with turning the boats back. Now, Indonesia has made it clear as late as yesterday that they would regard turning the boats back on the high seas as not only dangerous but counterproductive to good relations with them, and that it may affect the cooperation between Indonesia and Australia on border protection matters. So this is the great hypocrisy of the opposition. You know, their policy is to turn the boats back. It would be counterproductive and dangerous, but the Malaysian arrangement is, if you like, achieving the same outcome, returning people to where they began a boat journey, but doing so in a much more orderly fashion and with the protections built in.
You've also been exploring the options of reopening the processing centre on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. Doesn't that have the same lack of deterrent effect that Nauru had for the same reasons?
Well, I agree that offshore processing in and of itself, if it wasn't complementary to the Malaysia arrangement, would be of very, very limited value. Yes, I do accept the premise of your question, Lyndal. I've consistently said that Manus Island would only work effectively as a complement to the Malaysian arrangement. Standing alone by itself as an offshore processing centre would simply be another Christmas Island that happened to be in a different country. Now, Mr Abbott said 2 days ago he was prepared to work constructively with the government to look at legislative change, and he said as far as he was concerned all things were on the table, that he wasn't going to rule things in or out. Now, he appears to have walked back from that today. I hope he sticks to his original position and says that he's prepared to work with the government constructively with all options on the table. We've said that we'd go back and reflect on our policies in the light of the High Court decision. I hope that Mr Abbott's doing that too, and that's why we've made the expert briefing available to him to assist him to do that.
If Mr Abbott does want to limit legislative changes to only apply to Manus Island and Nauru, can you accept those changes? Is it possible to make country-specific changes to the Migration Act?
Well, look, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals about the legislative change that we might propose or that Mr Abbott might accept, but I will say this, our position has been consistent that offshore processing can be an important part of the regional framework combined with other measures, but simply reopening Nauru and Manus just by themselves, with the majority of people regarded as refugees ending up in Australia, is not an effective deterrent, and it would not work just standing alone.
Do you accept, though, that you do need the opposition to pass any legislative change, that the Greens wouldn't pass it in the Senate, so you'd need the opposition to back it, and you might be left with no option but to accept a limited cooperation from the coalition? Well,
I certainly accept the numbers in the Parliament, and that means that the situation is that the legislation would have a much, much better chance of passing if it's supported by the government and the opposition. Yes, I agree with you on that, Lyndal, but I'm not going to get into the minutiae of the hypotheticals of negotiation, other than to say we will obviously be making announcements about our approach. The opposition have said that they're prepared to work constructively with us, and I think Mr Abbott should stick to that.
Have you received advice that it is possible to change the legislation to allow, if you want it, the option of offshore processing for unaccompanied minors?
Well, obviously the High Court judgment had a big impact on unaccompanied minors. It effectively made the transfer of unaccompanied minors to anywhere unworkable, and that's something that Mr Abbott should really have a close look at, because he appears to be ignoring that. The High Court judgment was that an unaccompanied minor could only be transferred after certain procedures with judicial review, which would make the transfer of unaccompanied minors to Nauru or anywhere else effectively impossible. Obviously, the same goes with all the other legislative changes. We'd consider that, and we are considering that in the light of the High Court judgment. But really, Mr Abbott, who seems to be saying, or is saying, that there's no impact of the High Court judgment on Nauru, he's just wrong. There are 5 Queen's Counsel or Senior Counsel who said it has a big impact, and in addition to that, it's very clear and inarguable that the transfer of unaccompanied minors would be unworkable to anywhere under the High Court judgment without legislative change.
And have you got advice that that legislative change is possible to allow that option of offshore processing for unaccompanied minors?
Well, I'm not going to go through the advice that we've received, Lyndal, and continue to receive, other than to say, of course, we're examining all options and getting expert legal advice on it.
The left of your party and the Greens want onshore processing. Is it your advice that onshore processing only would trigger a flood of arrivals that could possibly overwhelm the current detention system, that could lead to community detention and that may lead to civil unrest?
Well, it's my advice and my position that offshore processing is part of a regional framework, together with the other initiatives, and Australia taking more of a role in resettling refugees from our region, is a proper disincentive to people getting on boats, and it follows that if you didn't have those proper regional arrangements in place, there'd be less disincentive to get on boats and more people making that dangerous boat journey to Australia. That's the case. In terms of, extrapolating that out and making predictions, well, I'll leave that to others. At this point, I'd simply make the point that we've been working very hard to get offshore processing as part of a holistic response, a proper considered response, not just as a bilateral measure with other governments or a unilateral measure by Australia, but as part of a regional framework. That's what I've spent 12 months working on, and that's why we think it's important to have offshore processing as part of that regional holistic framework.
But it is possible, isn't it? Or is it a possibility that onshore processing only could easily overwhelm the current detention centre and that could lead to community problems?
Well, Lyndal, I agree that offshore processing as part of the regional framework can be a proper disincentive, and therefore that it does provide that disincentive to get on boats, and if you don't have that, you will encourage more people to get on boats. We have seen a significant reduction in our detention population over the last few months. We had about 6,000 people in detention centres and facilities. That's now down to around 4,000 people. That's a significant improvement as a result of some of the changes we've made, but also because of the reduction in the number of boats arriving in Australia in recent months, partly as a result of the announcement of the Malaysia Agreement.
Julia Gillard's at the South Pacific Forum in New Zealand. She's meeting leaders of South Pacific countries, including the leader of Papua New Guinea. She says she's not going to raise the question of the options for asylum seekers. Why should that be the case? Why shouldn't she, if she's face-to-face with the leaders, just have a little discussion, say what's going on in Australia, what options you're exploring?
Well, Lyndal, the situation at the moment is that offshore processing is effectively unlawful in the view of the High Court in many, many cases, and our legal advice is that offshore processing on PNG and Nauru, the 2 countries most commonly mentioned, would be highly vulnerable to challenge. So how could the Prime Minister explore those matters with those leaders with that legal situation in Australia?
It's a legal situation you're working to change, isn't it?
But we have a memorandum of understanding with Papua New Guinea, Lyndal. We've signed an agreement with Papua New Guinea to open a detention centre on Manus Island, but we've had to put that on hold as we deal with the legal implications of the High Court judgment. Now, of course, we've communicated that to Papua New Guinea. They understand the situation. While that's being progressed here in Australia, it would be of no benefit to have further discussions, because unless and until the Act is amended and the situation in Australia is clarified, there could be no offshore processing of Papua New Guinea.
When are you likely to have a decision on what you're going to do for asylum seekers? Because presumably in the interim there may be people in the wake of the High Court decisions considering getting on boats to come to Australia.
Well, we're dealing with it expeditiously, as you would expect, but we're also dealing with it carefully. I mean, this is a big change from the High Court last week, and this has been a policy area that's bedevilled governments for 20 years, so we want to make sure we get it right. We're not going to knee-jerk a reaction. Yes, it's appropriate that we do it quickly, but it's also appropriate that we take a little bit of time to make sure we get it right, and that's what we'll be doing.
Finally, the Acting Prime Minister, Wayne Swan, has called for Liberal Senator Cory Bernardi to be sacked from his frontbench duties for apparently helping a controversial Dutch politician visit Australia. Senator Bernardi has been quoted today as clarifying his position, saying neither he nor the Coalition is organising any visit by Geert Wilders. Isn't that enough?
Well, the trouble is that Cory Bernardi is a serial offender when it comes to inappropriate commentary on multiculturalism, on matters of religion. Mr Bernardi, if Mr Bernardi says he's clarified, well, that's a matter for Mr Bernardi, but it's been widely reported that he's been involved in bringing out this individual to Australia, and frankly it fits with his form and his behaviour. He makes inappropriate comments about other people's religions, and it's, I think, high time that Mr Abbott dealt with him.
If Mr Wilders did want to come to Australia, would you grant him a visa? Well,
look, I'm not aware that he's applied for a visa, and we have a process in place for people with issues of character who've had criminal convictions against them. They get considered. It's elevated to me as Minister in appropriate circumstances. That's not occurred in this case yet. As I say, I'm not even aware that he's applied for a visa. If he has, then it would go through the processes and would be brought to my attention at an appropriate time. And I, as Minister, would weigh up the countervailing arguments, the seriousness of the offences that he's conducted, and the matters that go to his character. Really, I couldn't judge an individual case without looking at all the elements. It's something which happens regularly, ministers making decisions on visa applications where there have been character concerns raised. I don't comment on the individual cases, and I wouldn't comment on his. There'd be a process to go through.
Given that the Labor Party has been under pressure for some time over allegations being faced by one of your MPs, Craig Thomson, is a little hypocritical to call for the sacking of a Liberal senator when it's not entirely clear what he is and isn't doing in relation to this Dutch politician?
Well, Mr Bernardi is a member of the Liberal Party front bench. Last time I looked, I think he was Tony Abbott's parliamentary secretary, his right-hand man. Craig Thomson is a backbench member of the Parliament. He was a chair of a parliamentary committee. He's resigned from that position. Mr Thomson hasn't been charged with anything. There's been no charges brought against him, whereas Mr Bernardi is a serial offender when it comes to the matters of inappropriate commentary on other people's religion, and he is Tony Abbott's right-hand man. I don't think anybody's calling for Mr Bernardi necessarily to leave the Parliament, but clearly his frontbench position and his position as a key advisor to Tony Abbott really needs to be brought into question.
Chris Bowen, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndal.